This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
This presentation looks at question 2 from June 11 on the P5 exams. You're strongly advised to go and download a copy of this question and to read it before we start the presentation. If you don't do that, then you will not get the full benefit from the presentation. So I suggest you pause the video now and download this question paper from the ACCA site, and to read carefully through question 2. It'll take about 10 minutes for you to read it properly. And then we'll see how we should think about answering that question. Okay, the first thing you should always do is go to the requirements section to see what it's about. And here we see it's essentially about a balanced scorecard, 27 marks, a lot on a balanced scorecard, and the various models on non-financial performance measurement. Building block models, the performance prism, and so on. And here, of course, the balanced scorecard. They're very important. In most exams, one or other of these models is examined, and you really need to know them because the questions are really quite specific. Explain the performance prism. Or Fitzgerald and Moon's approach, or whatever it is. And if you don't know that specific approach, there's no point trying to answer the question on balanced scorecard. So what we need to do is to read all of the requirements. We have to make sure that we don't overlap, if you like, in our answers. We don't steal from, say, what we should be writing in answer C to answer A and so on. We want to make sure we address the requirements properly. We want to make careful note of the amount of marks which are available to each of these. And we see part A, describe how the implementation of a balanced scorecard delivers a range of performance measures aligned with the corporate strategy. Interesting. It's only 4 marks, and we always have to think whether or not a question is asking us to be very specific with regard to a scenario, or whether it's a more generic sort of question. Here it says implementation of a balanced scorecard delivers a range of performance measures. And I think it'd be clear if it said aligned with just corporate strategy, but it says the corporate strategy. But further on down, we have got stuff which is very specific here. Performance measures proposed for this particular company and so on. External stakeholders for another organization in here and so on. And I think for 4 marks, what it really wants is a general introduction to what a balanced scorecard does. And I would simply say here that what we have is 4 perspectives. You have your financial, you have the customer, you have your internal business, and you have the innovation and learning. What can we say for 4 marks? A range of performance measures. Yes, I think if you're not using something like a balanced scorecard, then there's an awful lot of concentration on the financial perspectives, things like the profit, the gross profit percentage, the return on capital employed, maybe the share price, earnings per share, and so on here. They all measure financial performance, but none of them explain what makes financial performance good. And what makes financial performance good is presumably a successful corporate strategy. And the corporate strategy is essentially saying if you're going to have good financial performance, you must have happy customers who keep coming back to you, are willing to pay you good prices or whatever. What keeps your customers happy and loyal It means that you do well what you purport to do. So your internal business must be good. So if your business is one which is providing very low cost components, then you must be good at that. If your business is one where you're producing very high quality components, then you have to be good at that. If your business is one where you have a very quick delivery service within a couple of hours, then you must be good at that. So what makes customers happy is up to the customers, really. And it almost ties in with the value chain. What adds value to the business, it is what makes customers keep coming to you and be willing to pay you a good price. What keeps our internal business perspective good? Well, we might be very good at, let's say, producing low-cost unit items now, but everyone's competing, and in a few years if we don't keep improving, then somebody else will beat us in our internal business perspective, and the whole financial performance ultimately rests on innovation and learning. Now, we probably had said more there than we could in 4 marks, but we'd have to go through, I think, each of the business perspectives and really say that there's a considerable range in here of performance measures which are going to ultimately be the cause of good financial performance. Part B asks us to evaluate the performance measures proposed for the balanced scorecard. So let's go up and see what they are here. And here we are. Finally, this leads to the proposed scorecard for performance measures, financial, etc., etc. And the requirements said evaluate. Whenever you see the word evaluate, in general, you want to look out for maybe some favourable points to make and also some criticisms. Evaluate really means make a judgment. So let's see what we could say about those with thinking in this drug testing scenario, how could we perhaps think about improving? So here they have the proposed scorecard for financial, share price and earnings per share. That's okay as far as it goes. Shareholders would be interested in that, but would they be perhaps interested in anything else as well? Well, they might be interested in dividends. We could say that economic value added is perhaps a better way of praising financial performance, insofar as it looks at the cost of their capital and compares that to your net operating profit after tax and so on there. Could look at return on capital employed as well. Let's just check what marks we've got in here. We have 10 marks here. There's 4 for 4 perspectives there, so about 2.5 marks each. So I think I would say here that financial is okay, but a little bit scanty. Why not look at dividends, economic value added, return on capital employed? You could even look maybe at sales growth. Profits growth, anything of that sort would be taken as giving some sort of information and to shareholders to judge financial performance. Customers, number of patients using PT products. Okay, if a large number of patients use PT products, then presumably those patients might be satisfied with the drugs, but do the patients actually choose the drugs here? There's a little bit of a question about who are the customers. Is it the doctors? Is it the government, because the government is paying the doctors and paying for the drugs essentially in this health service and so on here? We might be interested, would they not be interested maybe in costs? Health budgets are under considerable cost pressure, and customers are going to be happy, if customers of the government are going to be happy if the cost per pill are kept down and so on here. I would put in a slightly wild card one here, maybe thinking ethics. If I'm taking drugs produced by a drug company, I like to know that the drug company is ethical. that it has properly evaluated the performance of the drug, that any side effects are well known and documented, and so on. There could be effectiveness, efficacy. There's more and more publicly available information on the effectiveness of drugs and so on here. To some extent, there's almost reputation as well. Reputation of drugs. Again, it differs from country to country. But I've heard friends kind of recommending you should take that drug because it's really good and so on. Of course, it doesn't mean that friends know what they're talking about. But happy customers, whether patients or doctors or the government, I think we could. I mean, it's very narrow, just number of patients. We could widen that out considerably. Internal business processes exceeding the industry's standards on design and testing, time to regulatory approval of the product, and so on here. What else might we be interested in here? I would think maybe of the kind of reliability of the results. Part of the industry process which is being carried on here, 3 stages to confirm the safety of the drug, to test the efficacy of the product, and so on. We want to make sure that whatever internal business processes, whatever kind of research they undertake, is good. Learning and growth, training days undertaken by staff, time to market for new product, percentage of drugs bought by PT that gain final approval here. All a little bit hazy. I mean, training days undertaken by staff, it's maybe better than nothing, but it's maybe not great. I would put it fairly low down, maybe priorities here and so on. What about money spent on research and development? What about new methods of testing the efficacy of drugs and so on? There's a lot of happening now in biotechnology and so on here. The percentage of drugs bought by PT that gain financial approval, well, gain final approval, well, that's almost a little question mark there. Is this not putting an incentive in to approve or to maybe change the evidence so you get approval? Well, maybe there's a bit of a question mark over that. We should only approve drugs if they work. And I'm not sure that learning and growth is something which is measured by approving more drugs. It could be almost counterproductive there, I think. We could maybe look at maybe research papers published. Part C asks us to identify and analyse the influences of 4 different external stakeholders on the regulator BDR. Now here you have to be really, really careful. There's been a switch from PT, Pharmaceutical Technologies, to BDR, the Breland Drug Regulator here. The question does talk about stakeholders. Shareholders, purchasers, regulators, doctors, patients, but these are the stakeholders of PT. These are not the stakeholders of Breland's drug regulator. That's going to be quite different. And we have to think what those might be. We have to talk about the influence of them. And we're talking about stakeholders, and I would think that what you want to do is a Mendelov. Always good if you can bring a model in here. So the Mendelov's matrix, we've got in here, you have the power of the stakeholder, you have their interest, which is their propensity or probability that they're going to take some action here. You have low here and high here, let's say. So down here you've got your key players, here you have your keep satisfied, here you have your keep informed, and here we have your minimal effort. And who might the four stakeholders of Breland Drug Regulator be? And I think there's the government. Basically, Breland Drug Regulator is an independent body set up by the government specifically to regulate drugs. So the government is charging it with this regulatory function and presumably giving it some money and so on. There will be the drug companies. They're dependent on BDR for getting the regulatory consent to sell their drugs. There would be the patients who will benefit from drugs that work and which are provided to them. And I suppose there's the doctors, hospitals, other healthcare providers. 6 marks, so not too much in here, and I would just go through and think where I'm going to put some of these here. So let's think about the government. The government obviously has a lot of power. The government is partly funding the regulator here. It is funded directly by the government and through fees. It is governed by a board of trustees appointed by the government, so we're definitely down at this level here. Is the government liable to take an interest in BDR? And it will if BDR begins messing up. So if BDR wasn't fast enough in giving consent to new drugs, or was careless perhaps, and there was some great scandal about drugs which were consented to, then I would put probably government in here. A key player. It will definitely act if something goes wrong. Most of the time it'll take a back seat if BDR is doing the right stuff, but it will certainly wake up if something goes wrong. What about the drug companies themselves? Will the drug companies themselves have a great deal of influence over the regulator? I would hope not. I would hope the regulator is of independent outlook and mind and will only give assent to drugs which really work and which are really safe. Independent trustees, there's a little bit of a potential there because it does say that BDR is funded by government and also through fees charged to drug companies when granting licenses. So there may be a little bit of influence, but I would put drug companies pretty much up here, relatively low power, we hope. Are they likely to act at all if things don't go quite their way, they don't like what's happening? And I think they might be. I think they're quite powerful. A large drug company could make a lot of adverse publicity if its drugs were turned down by BDR, especially if they had been... So I think we have to keep in with them in a way, keep them informed, keep them on side, but ultimately they don't have a lot of power. What about the patients? I would argue that maybe the patients are here. They have very little power. Patients can't really prescribe many drugs to themselves and so on, so they can't really maybe boycott these or insist that they get them. And interested, well, they might be interested if they have the knowledge. But patients know what drugs have been allowed. They tend not to know very much about drugs which have been rejected. And are ordinary patients really going to say you should have allowed that drug and you didn't? I think patients are almost bottom of the heap, unfortunately, when it comes to this. And then finally we have got the doctors, and I would maybe put doctors in here as well. They don't have a lot of power. They can't insist that BDR gives permission to certain drugs. But if they thought that drug was being perhaps rejected by BDR, maybe because of its cost, again, they could probably summon up quite a bit of adverse publicity. And I think that would answer the question reasonably. Part D. Using your answer from Part C, that was on the various stakeholders, describe how the application of a balanced scorecard approach at BDR, that's the drug regulator, would differ from the approach within pharmaceutical technologies. So let's just remind ourselves what we had from Part C as stakeholders. We have government, we have the drug companies, we have doctors, etc. We have patients. Let's also remind ourselves what the balanced scorecard is. It's financial, it's customer, internal business, and innovation and learning. Let's think about, and let's ask us, how would it differ from the approach within PT? So within PT, we certainly had a financial perspective with things like dividends, or we invented dividends, earnings per share, return on capital employed, EVA were suggestions as well, and so on here. BDR is a drug regulator, and I would say that they have almost nil financial perspective. Of course, they'll have to live within their budget. They have got trustees, got certain qualified staff and so on there, but it is not BDR's objective to make profits. It is not BDR's objective even to save the government costs. It is BDR's prime objective to be the regulator. And I think here that the financial perspective for this non-profit seeking organization is more or less missing. Who are their customers? And I think this is quite interesting. PT's customers were the people who bought its drugs and so on, doctors and health providers and so on. To some extent, customers, you can look to stakeholders. Who is relying on the work which the BDR is actually doing here? And of course we have the government. The government is looking to BDR only to approve drugs which are safe. We have patients who are looking to BDR to approve drugs which are safe and to make sure that new drugs are brought online quickly enough. And we have the doctors. So within our customer perspective, we have multiple stakeholders, multiple objectives, really. And we're having to balance things. We have to make sure that we don't bring in drugs which are dangerous. The government would be really interested in that, as indeed would patients and doctors. But we have to make sure that we don't take too long, that maybe the government influence isn't so cautious and risk averse that patients are suffering because drugs which may be reasonably effective are not brought through quickly enough. How can we measure this? And this again is rather difficult. How do we measure how happy patients and doctors and governments are with the performance of BDR? In PT, it was easier to measure. You could measure it on sales, you could measure maybe on number of patients using the drugs, etc., on popularity of drugs. It is getting much harder to measure how satisfied the various customers are in BDR's performance. Internal business perspective here. We're not making something, we're dealing with approval and so on here. I think that gets a little bit easier here. I think we could look at the time taken for BDR to go through the approval process. We could perhaps look at their methodology. Do they adopt methods and approaches which allow approval to be obtained reasonably quickly and so on. We could be looking at kind of waiting lists. How many new potential drugs are awaiting regulatory approval and have simply got caught in some queue somewhere and so on. We could look at mistakes, where BDR has maybe approved drugs which turn out to be dangerous and they shouldn't have given the proof. Or 5 years after not approving of something, they suddenly change their mind and say, well, that should have been approved all the time. Innovation and learning, kind of a little bit tricky here. These people are not inventing new ways of testing drugs or proving their safety, but what they might be able to do is to suggest new types of evidence. So if they had discovered that perhaps they were very slow at approving drugs, and this was bad for internal perspectives, then maybe what they ought to do is to maybe put pressure on people, or to look around the literature to see if there were new ways in which evidence could be collected, or maybe cooperation, maybe with other countries. So if we looked at maybe the way drugs were approved in, let's say, United States, which has got quite a tight regulatory program on new drugs, see how they do it. Or maybe to say, well, it's approved in the United States, maybe we don't have to go through all the tests that we would need to if it hadn't got approval somewhere else. Then by cooperation with other countries, we might be able to innovate a way in which we could cut down the time taken to approve of those. But I think the main difference is this lack of financial perspective and a rather more complicated customer perspective in BDR than there is with PT.